10x your service design offering with Smaply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smaply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smaply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Folks, welcome to another episode of Bringing Design Closer, the podcast focused on discussing design's role in tackling sometimes complex societal issues. My name is Jerry Scullion and I'm a service designer, and I'm the founder of This Is HCD and the CEO of thisisdoing.com, where we provide live online design and innovation classes providing training for people within the design and change making space. We also have our new Doing Design Festival. The next one up is on June the 18th. With the theme of doing design online with some of the This Is Doing team, talking about loads of really interesting content around that whole space. For more information, see doingdesignfestival.com. Before we jump into this episode, I want to alert listeners that this episode may contain content that is triggering to some people. In it, we discuss sexual abuse and working with design alongside issues of trauma. But today in the show, we have Rachael Dietkus, a phenomenal person, someone who I really enjoyed speaking with. And she's an advocate for trauma-led approaches in design. And first and foremost, Rachael identifies as a social worker and is based 2 hours south of Chicago in Urbana Champaign in Illinois. And we speak in depth about trauma as a societal problem that is owned by all. We go into the details around working in this space and the effects it can have on us change makers and how we, as designers and change makers, are very much exposed to this reality. How might we protect designers from likely vicarious traumas in this space? How can we prepare the next wave of change makers to be ready? We speak about what designers need to be aware of when approaching some of the most sensitive subjects known, such as child sexual abuse, domestic violence, etc. Can and should design be seen as the savior? It's a big conversation. It's a wonderful conversation. It's pretty raw. We've both exposed ourselves, and it's a fantastic one, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's get straight into it. Rachael, how's it going? How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm not so bad. We've been chatting for the last hour or so about everything and nothing probably at the same time. But we found out you're based close enough to Chicago to probably call yourself maybe a Chicagoan.
That might be
a stretch,
a bit of a stretch. Although I did live in Chicago for a few years, though.
Yeah, we've just discussed that there might have been a crossover, and I was living in Chicago for a summer.
We may have. I think it's entirely possible that we may have crossed paths.
For anyone listening, when I was a student, I worked in Chicago as a ticket person for a tour company called Grey Line Trolley Tours, and I used to stand on the street selling these tickets to all these tourists and singing Frank Sinatra, songs on the back of these buses for tips. That was me, folks, and just look at me now.
Look at how far you have come, Jerry.
I know,
This is quite remarkable.
How far I've fallen. It's like,
No.
On the back of those trolleys going around Wacker Drive and all those wonderful places in Chicago. But, Chicago is a great city though. But what I've learned, I was living up near Armitage and Bissell.
Okay.
A couple of great pubs up there. And I was like, Chicago's so safe. It's so safe. And I remember saying it to someone years later, and like, Chicago's a city at two halves. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I think when you just mentioned the north side and the south side, I immediately drew this connection to baseball and the Red Line and
Comiskey Park.
Well, and in the summertime, I know I still think of it as Comiskey too. I think it's had 2 or 3 other names since then. I don't even know what the current name is, but I still think of it as Comiskey. But in the summertime, when the Chicago Cubs and the Chicago White Sox play each other, the Red Line.
Oh, really?
The marketing for the Red Line says the only thing these two teams have in common, because like you can take the Red Line from Wrigley Field to Comiskey, which I always got the biggest kick out of. but but you're right. I think any city, whether it's a small one like where I am in Champaign, Urbana, Illinois, or a much larger metropolitan city like Chicago, there's so much happening, and the dynamics can be really varied. But when you're living in the city, you don't necessarily feel that. I mean, I lived there for a few years, and I don't remember feeling necessarily unsafe. I felt comfortable because of most of your neighborhood, in a lot of the neighborhoods in Chicago, you kind of have everything that you need. You have like the small corner grocery. You have the neighborhood bar or pub. You have like a couple little like restaurants and places where you can go. And so you feel this sense of home and belonging even within this very massive city where there's a lot that's happening. So when we were talking, like during the first hour, I was really thinking back to some of those elements, and it's a great thing to be able to experience when you actually live there and you can fully appreciate that.
Let's talk about your work, because the reason why we're here today is one of our mutual connections and friends, Kellyanne McKercher, mentioned you to me a number of times. But you're a social worker. Is it fair to say, is that how you identify as a social worker first and foremost? Because you also work as a designer.
Yeah, I feel like I've more recently had a bit of, I'm having not an identity crisis. That, how ironic would that be to say, I'm a social worker having an identity crisis? But I think when you work in more than one discipline, which is what I've been doing for the past, handful of years, it's like which identity do you claim first? But for me, I am a social worker, and I'm a proud social worker, and I've been coming at this work in design and just social work as a whole from multiple different angles and from different experiences. So I often call myself a social worker in design, but I also do identify as a designer and as a design researcher and do design strategy. But I think owning some of those titles can sometimes trip us up. Like how do we actually demonstrate that in our work? How do we put that in context depending on who we're talking to as well?
Yeah, absolutely. As a social worker, describe what a social worker typically does. I know it probably varies between departments and countries as well, but like typically, what does a social worker do?
What does a social worker do? So social workers are trained helpers in the U.S. at least, and especially in the state of Illinois where I am. In order to even call yourself a social worker, you have to have gone through an undergraduate program in social work or a master's program in social work. And then you have to go through a whole rigorous process of getting your licensure and then continuing education. And social workers work in a number of different arenas and domains. They work in systems. They work within organizations, policy, advocacy. They might do community work. They might do one-on-one therapy with individuals, do work with groups. Almost all social workers have received some type of fairly rigorous clinical training. And I mention that because that is quite the majority. And even though I'm a licensed clinical social worker, which, that acronym might look like something different depending on where you are in the world. Sometimes, it's called like LMSW, so licensed master social worker. But for me, I've got my clinical licensure, but I didn't really do the clinical track. I studied macro social work, so I went in with this thinking and just desire to better understand systems and policy and advocacy and leadership, and what does that mean to do through a social work lens, but in a variety of different contexts. And I mentioned that on a personal level because I think that helps to explain some of that variety, that you don't necessarily have to be a clinical social worker to do work with organizations and people and systems. You can be more of a systems thinker and try to, navigate and problem solve and advocate for a variety of things with a non-clinical background. But part of that fairly small crew of social workers who did the macro track, but then went on to do a lot of clinical work.
Okay. So when you say the macro track, what does that mean?
So macro, in the context of social work, there's I feel like sometimes social workers are their own worst enemy. Like we're constantly trying to delineate, one type of social work to another. I mean, it's very similar in design. It's like, are you a graphic designer? Are you a human-centered designer? Or are you a service designer, a social impact design? In many ways, it's like you're just a designer or you're just a social worker. But in the context and the educational training and preparation that you get as a social worker, you are often really encouraged to pick some type of a track or a specialization and really like hone in on that, because it's going to guide you towards the practicum or the field experience that you're going to do as part of the educational training, and or really like just set you up for what is going to be your maybe like early stage career within social work. So macro social work is really, it's really the origins of social work. So if you look back to, just both formal and informal social work and just a helping of other individuals and of groups of people and in communities, it was really truly rooted in social justice and advocacy. So helping individuals on both an individual level, but on a more collective level, to have a holistically better life or better outcome, whatever that might be or however that might be defined. So macro social workers are not typically doing, one-on-one therapy or what we have come to know as, psychotherapy or clinician or counseling work. You're really focused on organizational health, community health, what is the overall health and well-being of a system, and what is anemic or what is systemic and what might need to be addressed at a root cause. Macro social workers are really thinking in terms of policy. What are the origins of policy? What needs to be adapted and changed because it is not serving individuals or groups of people? What are some of the different ways that there can be I would really say just a greater good, an impact like more at scale. There are times when you're working with individuals, of course. I mean, like individuals make up systems, but the more system approach really is just a different orientation and training that more macro oriented social workers get.
Yeah. So some of the work that you've done in your past in that macro track, as you would say, from speaking with you earlier, it includes working with people who've suffered from trauma at some level. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. I don't know if I would have, even back then, when I think back of some of the work that I've done over the past, at this point, 20 plus years, it's crazy to say that. It's like, oh, I want to be able to say I've only been doing this a few years, but that would be disingenuous, right? But I can look back and I can reflect back and realize that I've worked with a lot of individuals and systems that have been deeply traumatic. Yeah. But I don't think we would have identified it as that explicitly.
Yeah, because trauma, when you're within it, sometimes it's hard to actually pinpoint that is the trigger. And when I was working, there was a space in Australia a project that I was involved in that we discussed, and some people, long-time listeners will understand. I worked with vulnerable groups in New South Wales as part of a big project in the justice system. And working within trauma, it gave me a new sense of respect for what trauma was. Like before, I thought I kind of had a decent understanding of what trauma was. I'd experienced little bits probably in my life, but when you get close to the people who have suffered what can only be described as extreme trauma in terms of sexual abuse or domestic violence or any type of violence, really, I had a newfound respect for what the word trauma meant and could mean. So I'm really keen to understand your perspective on what trauma means to a person.
Well, it's very individualized, first and foremost, so what may be a traumatic experience or a traumatic event for you may not result in, some form of either acute or just residual or long-term trauma. And I think that's one of the most important things to distinguish. There's a psychotherapist, Pat Ogden, who often says everyone has experienced trauma, but not everyone will be traumatized. And that really helps to just understand that it's very individual and what your childhood, what your family of origin, what your life experiences up until this point in your life are all contributing to how you may or may not respond to something, or how it might linger, or maybe you don't respond, immediately right now, but it could be either triggered or it could come up in a different kind of a setting or a situation like later on in life. I've heard of that kind of trauma and that kind of a traumatic impact with a lot of people who are especially probably around our age. Like you're in middle age, you're in that messy middle of, potentially caring for family members who are older than you, but also younger than you. And, you're juggling like all the different things, and they're different life experiences that are going to maybe come up or bubble up that are going to make you think about or reflect on other things that may have been either extremely suppressed or dormant for a very long time.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about what you've just said there around trauma. And when I encountered that project, I started researching more and more. And as I got closer to the world, I realized that my initial target group for, the scope was going to be children who'd suffered from sexual abuse. And if there was one project in the world that I would have said I would never take on, it would have been that. But when I had got close to it, I felt like this sense of obligation where I'm like, okay, this is something I need to see, I need to experience. And as I got closer to it, I realized that there was so much stuff there that was just out of my league. I was like out of my depth, both culturally, like, the sensitivity in working with Indigenous and Aboriginal groups in Australia. Like I really had to learn very quickly about how to work sensitively and inclusively. And I felt that for me to approach it effectively and use what can only be described as a standard design process would have been hugely disrespectful, because I was not skilled enough as a practitioner to approach that without the support of incredible people in the New South Wales justice system and the health system, both psychologists and social workers. And I realized at that point that it was probably my first encounter into what is now known as co-design, where I realized that I had to push myself. I was no longer the designer. I was the facilitator of those conversations between these worlds, because it was bigger than me. And I realized what I could potentially do and achieve with these people was far greater, and I could have a much deeper impact. So I guess, I know the work that you're talking about here, and I've obviously done some research on you yourself. You call out that you're committed to trauma responsive design and practice. Okay, so am I right in saying that design generally could trivialize this as being like the who knew all you need to do was use design to solve some of these problems? And it is a sense that could be seen, and that's something that I'm hyper aware of, that design can sometimes be seen as the silver bullet to the solution to these things, and it's not. It's like, it's people, and bringing these people together to have these shared conversations and shared perspectives and shared experiences, and be respectful to the people that we're trying to design for.
Oh, there's so much that is coming to mind. I think that design as a whole, everything is designed. Everything in our world and in our awareness has been designed in some way, shape, or form. So design is a beautiful and a magnificent framework to think about how we might address elements of trauma, or at least give them some due and very fair and very respectful consideration. But design is not the silver bullet. And if it's done recklessly or careless in a careless manner, unethically, the thing that really started to gel with me, I'd say probably like during my time when I was at Veterans Affairs and working with a wide variety of different disciplines. There was a year when I spent working with we call them the leader of a department, was called like the chief. So the chief engineer at this particular VA that I was at. And I really saw this very clear-cut opportunity for two very different people and personalities and educational training to be able to work together and really complement one another. Now, a lot of other things factored into that. You know, we were roughly around the same age. We grew up within a few blocks of each other. We didn't know each other growing up, but we had other things that where we were able to build this trust and this very strong rapport. And I think about how that experience was so rooted in this foundation of respect for one another and for each other's discipline, that it was a very impactful experience on how I think about this work in a broader design context.
Yeah.
One of the other things that comes to mind is just, you know, you mentioned a couple of things, Jerry. You talked about, you know, I felt like early on I had this obligation to do this work, you know, almost anticipating and knowing that it could be, or it might be like too big or too much too soon. You know, it might be overwhelming. I mean, I'm like you. I haven't done a lot of work with children, and I've been intentional with that. I know that I know that I'm wired a certain way, and I have certain strengths, but I also, you know, there are always two sides of the coin. I'm pretty aware of some of my weaknesses as well, and that would be very, very hard work to do for any person. But there's some of this work and some of these experiences, they are much bigger than us. And how do we develop these understandings with this orientation of just really practicing with, I would say, beyond just empathy, but compassion and humility. You know, the compassion piece, you know, empathy is, you know, constantly used in this work, and it's constantly used in social work too. You know, I remember one year I was working at the school social work where I got my degree. I was the assistant dean, and I reviewed all the applications. And I remember making this little like checklist on the side, and I thought, you know, I'm going to track every single time a student uses the word empathy in their application. Well, 100% of the students use the word empathy in their application.
Yeah.
And as time went on, I thought, like, what does this word even mean? I don't even know if I understand what it means to be, like, you know, empathic. And, you know, anyway, kind of, I easily get off my own tangent here.
keep talking about empathy, because, I mean, they go hand in hand with what's typically classified as, like, you know, you're working with something where there's quite a lot of hurt and a lot of pain. And like the role of the designers, especially like that's been practiced and preached about in design thinking and stuff, is like there's a stage there called empathy in the traditional design thinking framework. Empathy, we're going to do the empathy work now. And everyone in the room, we're going to be empathetic. I always kind of laugh. It's just really about deep understanding is at its core. But I mean, working with people and working with these complex problems, it's hard not to, you'd have to be very cold not to feel some sort of emotional response to these stories. Like they're heart-wrenching, and it's not just an incident of where child A lives life, something happens, and then child A continues. It's a cycle of mass systemic problems that range from multiple different areas. And I remember being in one of the Sydney Children's Hospitals and saying, you know, there was quite a low uptake for services around trauma support. And I couldn't understand it. I was literally I was dumbfounded when they said this to me. I was like, so the parents bring the child in and there's not an uptake? Why? Like, the child must be going through something. And they said, you need to understand, this is not the worst thing that's happening in their lives. And it was that moment of realization where I'm coming from a privileged background, like I'm white, I'm male, I'm Western European, I'm sitting here, I'm like, okay, so the research takes on another level. It's a much broader scope. I'm like, what socio impact is being had on these people? Like, I need to understand that. So it's layers and layers of pain. It's not, we can't use a cookie cutter approach to these problems. There's even wicked problems, I feel, is doing it at the service. So it's huge.
It is huge. And, the piece that you mentioned about empathy, like, like now we're going to do empathy. Like we're at the empathy stage. To me, that has always been unsettling. And I had some initial early on red flags where I thought like, that's kind of, it's strange that there's a stage of empathy. Is empathy not part of the entire process? Like that should be considered and thought about and incorporated before you even begin. Like once you start, throughout, at the very end, and then how do you? And again, like thinking about this through this lens of social work, like what would be that? How would I take care of that, and how would I pass that off warmly to the next person that might need to take good care of that situation or that individual? And I started wondering, like, is empathy a practice? Is it a muscle that you can build? Are some people just intrinsically, like motivated to do it, like no matter what? I'd say all of the above are very much true. But what I see as a fairly persistent, unfortunately, I do think this is changing, but what I see is a persistent way of doing empathy or being empathetic. It's very transactional and it's not relational. In social work, if you are a transactional, empathic social worker, you are going to get called out. You are going to make the life or the lives of the people you are supposedly working with or helping, you're going to make it worse. And it might not be immediately in that moment, but I remember distinctly just having some rough days early on as a social worker, and some of the the clients and individuals who I was helping, they would bust me out on it. They would point out, like, you're not being very helpful. It's like, no, I'm not. I'm in a bad mood. I had a bad day, and I have a baby who kept me up all night. At the time, I think about some of these experiences and how they bring to the surface, like what does it mean to be empathic and present and understand and actually kind of like help hold some of those stories that people are sharing with us. I know we've said the word empathy a lot so far. I use the word compassion quite a bit because compassion is not without empathy, but it has more of an action oriented angle to it. And so, like, what if we had these stages in design, but then there's just this continuum of compassion, like from pre-point A to like the final stage of what we're doing. I think that would sit differently for us as designers and for the people we're designing with or for or from. Yeah.
Compassion is something that I completely agree, because one of my good friends, Adrian Tan, who some of the listeners might know from ProdPod, another podcast, but made the point that I had a shift moving in when I was working in those worlds, that I moved from an empathetic state to a sympathetic state. And I suddenly was I was wallowing in sorrow because, the system was extremely complicated, and it wasn't just like looking at it from an ecosystem map. It was just layered, and it was in 3 dimensions, and it was very, very complex. And I got to the point where I just felt defeated. And I was like, the system, from having a pretty successful track record with projects up to that point, I had to basically throw my hands up in the air and say, okay, maybe this one is just too difficult for me to tackle, and let's try and see what I can potentially do to try and make an impact. And it's hard, but compassion, from your perspective, I guess it'd be good to understand what people can take away from this, in terms of, like, they might say, well, I do my research and I understand the problems. I don't allow myself to get too close to the problem, and I try and remain as effective as possible and deliver something and then iterate from there. But I'm saying, in my mind, it's very difficult to sometimes get out of that state because these problems aren't transactional, as you would say, from designing a wireframe and like people can't use the wireframe because, X, Y, and Z. These are service design projects, and these are policy-based projects that really at its core require systemic, organizational, and societal change, like a radical rethink of how we hold those mental models of what government could and should be. Mm-hmm. And those failings are really hard for a designer to come to that conclusion, but it was for me anyway. I really struggled with the fact that my beloved design framework that I held in total regard, I was like, we can actually go through this. If we just move to the next stage, we might be able to get to some reality, and we might be able to. I'm like, okay, there's a lot more work to be done in this. It was bigger than me, and I guess I'm keen to hear your perspective on that.
Well, it's these systems and these design projects and processes that we are tackling within these much larger systems are incredibly complex. And you could spend your entire life trying to understand them. And I think it's, if there is an ability or an opportunity to have not just compassion for others, but compassion for yourself as well, in knowing that you can't understand all of it. You can't understand all of the good and the bad and everything in between within some of these very large systems. However, can you do your due diligence to understand as much as possible so that it will be helpful for your overall work? There's something to be said about understanding the context within where you are working. And that is going to give you an enormous on-ramp to understanding some of the pitfalls, but also some of the shortcomings of what you are actually able to do. I do think that there are sometimes I've talked with a lot of designers from, at this point, really around the world. So either designers, design educators, social workers who want to get into design, designers who are just fascinated by what social workers could and do. And there's this, something that often comes up is, I want to be able to do X, Y, and Z, but I just want to be able to do it. I want to do it and I want to do it quickly. And this urgency to just rapidly solve other people's problems, I think, is part of the problem. It's some of these things need time to marinate. They need time to build that actual understanding, to include the very people that we are designing for or with, or sometimes from. And the thing that I hear sometimes, but not often enough, is this incorporation of reflection throughout this process. What is it, why am I doing this work? I almost want to turn the tables on you, Jerry, and ask, why did you feel that sense of obligation, all those years ago when you were working on some of these vulnerable, projects? Where did that sense of obligation come from? Was it because of, your earned and unearned privilege? Was it, this is an issue area that you don't necessarily understand? There's a whole host of questions that I could ask you and encourage you to think on those several examples of why. And I think when I've asked, especially younger designers, when I've asked them some of those things, I realize that they haven't asked themselves that, and they've never been really asked that. They haven't even just paused to reflect on why do you want to contribute to this particular project or this particular program or this particular process? There's a lot of reasons why we might be motivated to do some of the design work that we do.
Yeah, it's personal experience. Do you think that's something that makes working in this space more effective? Do you think if someone has experienced some level of trauma, at whatever level that might be, do you think that prepares them better for working in this space?
I would say it sounds like I'm hesitating on my response, because my immediate reaction was, yes, absolutely. However, I have a small caveat with that. I think that there is something to be said, and there is an immense value in understanding origin stories of your own trauma. I do think, especially now that we have all around the world like lived through and continue to live through a pandemic. I think the statistics in the US pre-pandemic were something along the lines of 75% of adults in the United States have experienced at least one traumatic event in their life. I would wager a bet that statistic is now currently 100%. And what does that look like for you? What does that look like for you? What does that look like for me? How are you acknowledging it? How are you potentially addressing it if it is overwhelming? And then how are you recovering and integrating that into your life and then into your work? I think those latter parts are really, really scary for a lot of people. It's easy to default to, I'm just going to keep busy. I'm going to stay productive. All of the elements of white supremacy culture, to be quite honest. It's, why would I deal with my own stuff? I don't have any stuff. Like, that's them. And, I think about something that Bessel van der Kolk said in a training I did with him back in the fall. And it was all around, the body keeps the score and trauma and preparing, a ton of clinicians to have this deeper understanding of trauma and how it affects us both psychologically, but also like physiologically. And he shared this very detailed and intimate story of a client situation. And this is all over Zoom. So if you could hear a pen drop, like you could have heard a pen drop when he was talking about this. And then he starts saying something along the lines of, as clinicians and as people who are licensed professionals, we have got to get over this thinking that it is us as the helper and them as the person who needs help. He said, we are them. Like, we are them. And it just like that had a massive cognitive shift in my head. It's like, oh my goodness, like that, like we don't think of it that way. We think of it as, again, like these elements of transaction, power over, like we are here to help, we are here to save. I mean, this is a problematic in design, but also very problematic in social work as well.
Yeah. It's funny because that whole kind of white perspective on things, and it's us and they've got the problem. At the end of that, I came to the realization that if people, the people who receive the trauma and like have the effects of these trauma, we are part of the problem. And like we create these problems within society ourselves. And as a result, we have a responsibility to look at it squarely in the eye and see what role you have to play in that problem. It may seem pretty simple in terms of being able to dilute it down to that, but in terms of what I do on a day-to-day basis and how I look at the world shifted after that project. And some projects that you take on in your life and in your career will define you. That's what I've learned. And the project that I'm speaking about there completely defined me. It's the reason why I podcast. It's the reason why this is HCD is in existence. But when I look at homelessness and I look at drug addiction and, things that I ultimately would have shied away from in my younger self, I now, like when I'm out, I do whatever I can. I'll speak to those people, and I'll say, hey, if I can, and this is not me trying to say, by the way, that I'm a great person or anything of the sort, but I'll acknowledge their existence and I'll acknowledge their presence. And I'll introduce, my children to these things. They'll say, why is that person sleeping in a sleeping bag? And I'm like, well, they are not lucky enough. Things have happened to them. I'll try and explain these things to my children, to explain that it's not something that we just shy away from and we don't shine the light on it. I think it's really important that, in terms of schools and in terms of educational practices, that we include these problems in our projects, because if we are all part of the problem and we're all part of the solution, when we're working on any projects, albeit in banking or if we're in real estate or whatever it is, they will have 100% an impact on society. Okay. There will be another thing in the broader zoomed out perspective of the world that's going to have an impact. And it's very rarely thought like that. It's being very much focused on we'll achieve this to get our own personal and greater business good, but it won't be considered in the socio impact on the project it's going to have on life.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's fair to say? Like, this is where the shortcomings in design comes. It's a very narrow focus, and the framing is very narrowly defined within projects in terms of we get our outcome, we're happy. Whereas they don't really seem to consider that whole total zoomed out perspective of, well, what are we designing out of the broader life ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. I mean, like looking at things like intersectionality, root cause analysis. I mean, if you really, I mean, just looking at an issue like homelessness, housing and homelessness, if we really looked at the root cause, we would be going far beyond the individual who is currently at risk of homelessness or, is housing insecure. We would look far beyond that. We would look at where is the policy, where is the profit driven aspect of this that is contributing to this problem. We would look at it. We would look at the power asymmetry that is truly significantly imbalanced and is contributing to this plight. You mentioned something about that particular work and it had a lasting, lifelong impact on you. And I think there's something to be said about that and thinking and reflecting on that and considering what is that for us as designers. For me, I've been a social worker at this point for 11 years, but I've been working, professionally, whatever that means, professionally, my air quotes, for 20 plus years. And I'd say the most significant work that has impacted how I think about this, which is something that I don't really talk about all that often, was capital punishment work in Chicago back in the early 2000s. That work had a profound impact on my psyche, my way of thinking in terms of systems, helping individuals, helping family systems that are impacted by maybe one individual. And that has really shaped and molded, and led to why I became a social worker, why I like to think about design beyond just the project scope that we have at hand for this, tangible, doable thing. I get the aspect of why we need to have a narrow scope to maybe do something, but can we build in a broader understanding of what that context is? I mean, there's a, thinking about and bringing it back to some of these elements of trauma. I think about this line that Resmaa Menakem, he's a social worker here in the U.S. and a well-known trauma specialist. And, the first time he said that trauma decontextualized can look like personality, and trauma in a person, when it's decontextualized can look like personality. I thought, oh my God, how much of my own stuff has been, maybe distorted or influenced or put through this lens of what my personality might be, whether it's being cynical or being funny or being, maybe more optimistic on this particular day. I mean, those context really, really matters, but I don't think that is explicitly built into some of the projects that we work on. I don't think it is given the due diligence or the value within a lot of organizations. I think that there are individuals, this is something that I've been seeing anecdotally. I think there are a lot of individuals and teams of people who have reached out to me who have said, I feel like we're working on fill in the blank project and we don't know what we're doing and we are not prepared to hear some of the things that we are being told. And I feel like we need to get some kind of training or build up some kind of competency in terms of being trauma informed. Can you help us? And I think, what does the leadership look like at your organization? Who's the design director or the design lead? Are they aware of this? Are they aware that you're having some of these thoughts and reactions? Some people there have been some who have explicitly shared with me that if they bring up that they are impacted by the work that they are doing, which is commonly known as vicarious or secondary trauma, that if they bring that up in an organizational setting, that they don't use this language. This is how I've been interpreting some of this. They're seen as, well, why did you ask the questions that you asked? What did you do that elicited that kind of a response from someone? I mean, that's shaming behavior. That is a shameful response to people who are having a human reaction to
these problems,
to really challenging problems.
It's funny because for listeners will know that I experienced very extreme vicarious trauma from that project, and it took me a long time, and it still kind of lingers within me, that vicarious trauma, and it's something that I had to seek professional help for quite a while. But I felt at that time, the working in the space, I knew when I was within it, I was like, I'll just get through this, because I was that superhero syndrome where I can do this, I need to be able to get through this. But just dealing with that sort of let me come to the conclusion of the weaknesses that we all possess, and I wasn't prepared, both mentally, physically prepared for working in that space, So as researchers, how do we better train and prepare people for this? Is it a case that I mentioned that you're licensed. Okay, so presumably that means that you've studied some skills mechanism around self-support and support identification in others, and is that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
It's fair to say. So, but as designers and service designers, sometimes we find ourselves in these places that you don't find in the books. About go out to find user research or whatever you want to call it, design research. They don't prepare you for some of the conversations that you're going to have, around rape or child rape or these things, and you're sometimes stunned. Well, I was definitely stunned in several conversations where it's still kind of like, even saying those words just there, has a triggering effect for me. And I wasn't prepared. I just was not prepared. And I think it's one of the things that we need to become better at as designers, to prepare designers and design researchers for these real conversations, because we shy away from them. We can't tackle them. So how do we do that? How do we prepare the next generation of designers as they're leaving universities or learning where on the jobs, whatever it is, the next wave? How do we prepare them better to become more, as you would say, licensed, self-aware?
Or just trauma-informed and trauma-responsive.
Yeah.
There are a lot of different ways to maybe answer that question. One is the assumption that, if you've received a formal education in design and then you have this linear path into doing design work, whatever that specific aspect of that might be, one way to address this is in the design curriculum, like in education. So whether it's these, certificate programs that are trying to churn out, trained designers in these 8-week, rapid sprints, which I think that there is good opportunities with some of that, but I think that there are also massive shortcomings if we avoid some of these more difficult things. But I think in design education is one where this is starting to shift, at a higher education level, which I think is great. It needs to happen across the board and across the globe, though. So that's one. I think another is really looking at this distinction between, me as a social worker who has a clinical licensure, who is also working in this space of design. That's fairly unique. There are other social workers who are working in this context of design, which I think that's amazing. But, I'm as a social worker, I am held to a different standard. My profession has a code of ethics that I have to abide by.
Yeah.
I had to study for a very expensive test, and I had to pass that test in order to be able to call myself a licensed clinical social worker. as part of that requirement of licensure, I have to get a certain number of continuing education hours every 2 years, and I have to renew that and pay a fee to maintain my licensure. So there's something that is that's built into this professionalism of social work that's been around for decades at this point.
Yeah.
There's not an equivalent for that for design, you know? So if you have and I'm not necessarily calling that out. I guess I am kind of calling that out. I'm not calling for there should be a licensure for design. Yeah. There should be a code of ethics for design. But I guess I would maybe a different way of thinking about this is, why isn't there a code of ethics for design? Why don't you have some expectation that you have to do some type of competency-based, culturally aware training on some kind of recurring cycle? Yeah. Because the only designers who are thinking about these things critically and are, to be quite honest, kind of troubled by this lack of that structure are the ones who are seeking it out on their own. So they are intrinsically motivated. They're feeling some kind of like either moral injury or call to action to actually like address this, either for themselves internally or for their team or their project that they might be working on, or organization that they might be working within. So I would encourage those who are feeling that either call to action or that compass inside is guiding them to like, I need to learn more. I need to understand this better. Like, keep following that feeling that you're having, because there is education out there. There are different things that you can do and that you can take advantage of. Now, training for me as a social worker might look very different than training for a designer. And that's one of the things that I've really been, as I've been partnering with different people and talking about trauma-informed design, I'm really trying to make sure that there is not this, like, I'm a social worker and these are things that you could and should be doing, although you are not a licensed professional, like design practitioner. I think that there's a way to at least build some foundational understanding of what it means to be trauma-informed. Like, there are some principles that are, there are 6 explicit trauma-informed care principles in the U.S., but, other parts of the world sometimes they have 4, sometimes they have 5, sometimes it's 7. And those can be very, I think, fairly easily adapted in a design context. Like, there's a handful of us who have been talking about this and have really been trying to pick this apart and really think, okay, like, if we apply this outside of a social service agency or a healthcare setting where these trauma-informed principles were originally designed and kind of created for, how would this apply in the context of a design project, or in the context of interviewing someone, or in participatory design or in co-design? Like, I'm biased when I say this, so I'm almost hesitant to say it, but I'll say it. I think it's easily transferable. Now, it is a mindset shift, and it is a practice. That is something that I am constantly championing. So even though I've been working within a lot of the social justice space for 2+ decades at this point, I've been a social worker for over a decade. I am still learning too. So I have all the education. I have all the earned and unearned privilege. I have all of the training and all of the practice and the experience. And I am still learning too, So I think that's important to acknowledge, because I do know some things. I do have a grounded confidence in how I approach this, but there's still a lot to learn, and then I'm open to evolving as I incorporate this in my practice as well.
It's really interesting you've called that out, because working with people across government, especially in Australia, they all had one thing in common, and it was humility. And it was the sense that they can work with each other, and they knew what they knew, but they were also open about the fact what they didn't know. And it's one of the most important mindsets, I guess, for designers to work in these complex spaces, to retain that humility and say, well, actually, there's an awful lot I don't know about this. What can we do as a unit, as a team, or as I used to call them, super teams, because they were, greater than me. But I think, if there was one piece of advice that you could give to designers out there who might find themselves working in spaces that we might, and I'm doing air quotes here, find traumatic. How should they approach that, both in terms of conversations with their design leaders and also approach it in terms of method, in terms of inclusion of, say, social workers or psychologists or whoever that might be? So what advice would you give to them?
I would definitely encourage them to, I would encourage them to include social workers in that process, whether it's ideally if it could be done throughout the entire phase of that process, which I think that there is some growing interest in some, demonstration projects where that is being explored and people are wanting to do that. I think if there is any one piece of advice, it's to really try to detangle those psychological and physiological reactions that you're having to this work. And so the first step really is acknowledging that something is off, or something is, like, you might be out of your league. You might need to bring in some other people. I'm hesitant to suggest that there is a checklist, because I think that gets us in this trapping of more transactional versus relational. Mm-hmm. However, I do think that there are some specific methods that can be incorporated in what it might mean to be trauma-informed or trauma-responsive when you're doing design. I really think that if you suspect that you're out of your league, you are 100% out of your league when you're when you're doing some of this work. I've had those feelings myself, even as a social worker. I remember early on, and again at Veterans Affairs, helping someone. I have this training, and I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I'm ready to help and solve all these different problems that are coming my way. But sometimes someone would come in and they are so overwhelmed with their own tension and anger and frustration of the system that I could not, with all my skill sets and all my training and all my experience, I could not de-escalate them effectively in that moment. I had to bring in an additional person to help me run interference with that. I think just knowing that sometimes you have to call in others to assist. That's would we call that failure in design? I would actually call that, a massive strength.
One of the things that I called out afterwards was working within a team that had this kind of self-check-in where it was mandatory to talk about these things amongst the group. And even though I was part of a team that was really, really brilliant, they had identified some things, I guess, but it was only due to my own kind of doings of seeking external help with a psychologist that I was able to deal with it. I didn't want to show weakness, and it was more of a cultural thing, and it was probably a personal thing as well, where I just didn't want to show that the work was piling up. But I mean, from a method perspective, I totally agree with not making this a checklist activity and saying, okay, well, you could do these 3 things and then it'll be all right. It's not. It's really these topics and these things that we find ourselves sometimes researching and designing for and designing with. They need greater emphasis and we need to be able to give it as much respect as possible. And I just don't think it's possible from a design perspective just to approach it unilaterally. I think it has to be an inclusive process. So any of the work that needs to be done in the team, not just design leading the way, but also having social workers, psychologists, we're actually part of the team that's going to try and understand this together. I think that would make much more make better sense from a design perspective, in my world anyway, and my perspective. What are your thoughts on that?
I would say the same. And something that I started wondering just even a few weeks ago was, well, if there isn't a code of ethics for design as a whole, design as a discipline and as a profession, what if we started thinking about, again, let's start with self. What would be your personal code of ethics? And you don't necessarily need to share that with anyone, but but if you were to outline what you are willing and able to do and what you are unwilling and unable to do, that's going to give you some significant insight on where your strengths might be and where your weaknesses might be, and where there is potential to do more harm or to re-traumatize someone than to not. And we start literally with the micro, which is understanding your sense of self, your motivation to do this work, and really doing almost like an analysis of like, what are you able and capable of doing? Now, this might not apply to every single design scenario. I would wager a bet that everything is deeply interconnected, though, and that any of these practices of being trauma informed, or any of these methods that might be done as a team, actually acknowledging that there might be vicarious trauma that individuals on our team may be experiencing. Is there enough trust within that team to even be able to bring that up? If there isn't, then you might be hearing about it 10, 20 years later when you have an interaction or a run-in with that person and they share, hey, when I was working on such and such project, I was so young and I didn't understand what was really happening. But when someone shared like fill in the blank traumatic thing, it really had an impact on me. And it's kind of lingered for a really long time. I have heard dozens of stories like that from people from all over the world. Now, if those are things that people are willingly sharing with me, someone who like ostensibly that they do not know, then that I would think that is probably happening on a much more wider, unknown, systemic level.
Absolutely. Rachel, we're coming towards the end of the episode, and first of all, in case I forget, I want to thank you so much for giving me your time this morning. I know you got up extra early to speak with me, so in case I forget to do it on the podcast, I want to thank you for your time. It was truly appreciated. But if people want to reach out to you and learn more about what you do, what's the best way for people to connect with you? And so I can put those links into the show notes.
Yeah, so I think probably the two best ways. LinkedIn is definitely a good way. I have probably connected with nearly 1,000 people just through LinkedIn. I used to really underestimate the power of LinkedIn.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm like a spokesperson for them, and I'm totally not. So finding me on LinkedIn is definitely one way, but also through my site and through my work, Social Workers Who Design is definitely another good way.
Fantastic. I'll put those links into the show notes. But Rachel, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, Jerry, this has been awesome.
So there you have it. That's all for this episode of Bringing Design Closer. If you like this episode, feel free to visit thisishcd.com, where you can access our back catalogue of over 100 episodes, with episodes related to service design, product management, design research, and much, much more. Now, if you're interested in design and innovation training, feel free to check out our business, thisisdoing.com, where you can join online classrooms and learn from the world's best design and innovation leaders. Join the This Is HCD newsletter, where you'll receive updates from the network, and also, if you're interested, apply to join the Slack community on thisishcd.com. Stay safe, and until next time, take care.